Well, welcome to the final panel of the day on sources of modern executive power and constraint. My name is Kwaku Akoa. I'm a partner at Sidley Austin. The experience I bring to this is that for 3 years, from 2009 to 12, I was in the Office of Legal Counsel of the Justice Department, considering, in large part, separation of powers questions. I've got here as my panelists, two people who have far more experience at a far higher level than I do. Kathy Rumler, to my immediate left, was the White House counsel to President Obama, as was A.B. Culverhouse, and how he held the same role for President Reagan. So they've been at the very top in considering the question of what role the president's lawyers have in facilitating modern executive power and the constraints on modern executive power. And so I thought I would start right there. Some of you may be wondering what in the world the president's lawyers have to do with constraint on modern executive power. There's a narrative out there sometimes that the president's lawyers, or lawyers in general, only facilitate what their clients intend to do. There's maybe another competing narrative out there, or the idea about executive branch lawyers in particular, that they are there to say no, that their primary role is to shut down things that people in the executive branch want to do that are unlawful, perhaps unwise, inconsistent with norms. And my own experience is that neither of those sort of templates of what a president's lawyer does is exactly accurate, but I wonder if the two of you agree with either of those templates or have a more nuanced take on what exactly it is the president's lawyers have to do with power and constraint.
Okay, I'll start. I was going to say, I think President Obama would quibble with the idea that that his lawyers were there to facilitate.
I assume every person who held that office
yes,
would disagree.
President Reagan probably had the same reaction. So I think that I agree. I think that is a popular perception, and certainly there's some academic writing out there that would suggest that lawyers in the White House in particular are there to facilitate what the president wants to do and not act as a source of constraint. I think, at least in my experience, both things are true. It's absolutely certain, at least it was when I was the White House counsel, that a big part of my job was to figure out how the president could advance his agenda and do so within the constraints of the rule of law and within at least being mindful of political constraints and other types of constraints, including what the Congress could do, oftentimes in retaliation for whatever move the president decided to make. So I think that there is definitely a bit of that. And then in terms of engagement with other lawyers around the executive branch who were additional sources of constraint on executive authority, it was at times the role of the White House counsel to push those lawyers, not to push them to do what the president wanted to do, but to push them in a way to make sure that the advice that the White House was receiving from OLC and from other places in the executive was analytically sound, was not, kind of reflexively congressionalist and by that I mean, sort of in favor of the Congress in terms of power, and to sort of put them through their paces, if you will, to make sure that the advice that the president was getting was as rigorous as it could possibly be.
I agree with Kathy. By the way, thanks for having me. I did graduate from NYU Law many years ago. I think it's some of both, absolutely. I remember one esteemed member of the United States Senate kept sending Ronald Reagan a series of op-eds on a line item veto power being buried in the presentment clause of the Constitution. And we asked OLC to look at it, and then President Reagan asked for another opinion, so I asked the SG, Charles Free, to look at it. And I was sitting in the Oval Office when the president called the senator and says, Senator, I can't find a lawyer in the executive branch who agrees with this position. But on the other hand, I found that at given times, particularly in the legislative toing and froing, everybody else in the administration was willing to give away executive power, and it was my job to preserve and defend because in order to placate a powerful committee chairman or ranking member, you would find something that if it made its way into a signing statement, you would have to call it out as unconstitutional. Also, executive power and political power are intertwined. And you would find that at times at times you were making a bad political decision by standing too firmly on executive power with a small e. But the last thing I will say, the late great Lloyd Cutler came to see me my first week when I was White House counsel, and he had been White House counsel for President Carter and then later became White House counsel for President Clinton, and reminded me that as an officer of the United States that I was under a statutory obligation to report to the Attorney General the commission of any crimes of which I became aware. And that also was something I kept at the top of mind.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pointed reminder. You know, the point that AB was making about executive power and political power being intertwined is so important because you can have the strongest legal argument, that you could possibly have that something is within an executive's power. But if a president is weak politically, then that very well, that expression of power, that assertion of power may be diminished in a way that if the president was in a sort of different position politically, his standing was different politically vis-a-vis the Congress or vis-a-vis the public, he might be able to get away with a more muscular exercise of executive power in one context, and in a different context he would not be able to. And so, the White House counsel is uniquely situated among the lawyers in the executive branch to help with that assessment, to help the president and with the input of the other senior advisors to think about how a particular executive action fits into that larger framework. And so, and I know we're probably going to talk about this a little bit later, but it's not something that the Attorney General actually is in a very good position to assess, nor is it the head of the Office of Legal Counsel in a particularly great position to sort of assess that. And so these questions are just not purely legal ever when they rise to the question of what the president can or can't do in terms of executive authority.
So one of the things I found striking about both of your answers is that you went straight to the interbranch conflict, the potential, the actuality, the working out of day-to-day between the president and the Congress. So it sounds like maybe you viewed the role not only as power and constraint, but as something about a buffer or a broker in this separation of powers, interbranch rivalry. Is that an apt description?
Absolutely. I think, there's there is a sort of an ebb and flow really across administrations between the executive and the legislative branches that don't have anything to do with party. They're really about the separate roles that the two branches play. And I think that each White House counsel has viewed it in significant part as his or her responsibility to ensure that the executive doesn't give away power unnecessarily, and if it's going to assert power, that it's doing so in a way that doesn't backfire, that doesn't actually long-term diminish executive authority. So at least I know that I viewed it as a part of my job to ensure that the presidency, at least as long as I was the White House counsel, wasn't in a weakened state vis-a-vis the Congress or a weaker state than it was, when I took the role. And you probably felt the same way, that was a significant part of your day-to-day job.
I mean, absolutely. In many respects, the Office of Legislative Affairs, my good friend Ken Duberstein, who was the Chief of Staff and Deputy Chief of Staff, who was on an earlier panel, and others were deal makers. They were willing to make deals unless I put up a hard stop sign. And so there was a lot of to-ing and fro-ing, very serious. But the president had an agenda, and you would bump up against, hard stops where you couldn't do it. I think the thing that I swallowed hardest about was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, a huge foreign policy achievement of Ronald Reagan. That was where he stood at the Brandenburg Gate and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," and then went on to Moscow and finished negotiating that treaty. But we swallowed, I thought, an unconstitutional ratification condition imposed by the Senate. But it seemed like the greater good, the greater foreign policy imperative, the greater national defense imperative was going ahead and getting that treaty done. But that was a tough call for me. There's also times when the Congress is not really involved. I can think of we captured an Iranian Revolutionary Guard ship in the Persian Gulf that was laying mines in front of a U.S. Navy convoy. The collective views of all of the lawyers in the administration was, because there was not a declared state of war, that we could not keep the ship. Ronald Reagan wanted to keep the ship, but ultimately found another way to deal with it.
So both of you have focused in your answers on the erosive power of other actors on the president's executive authority. There are some, perhaps in this room, who would be thinking, wait, is that really the danger? Haven't we seen an accretion of executive authority over, call it, the past 2-3 decades? And what's the response of, or the proper role of the president's lawyers in ensuring that there's not too great an accumulation of authority in the president vis-a-vis the other branches of government, the states, et cetera?
Well, I think the most dangerous area there for potential excessive assertion of executive authority is in the national security and foreign policy area, and the reason is because there's much less transparency. Anything that the president does under Title 50 authorities, for example, are not seen even by all of the people's elected representatives, but just by a select few. And
you might tell those who don't know what Title 50 authorities consist of.
Yeah, it's basically authority that allows the executive to engage in covert action. And so, that's an area where if you don't have careful lawyers really thinking about how to impose constraints, authority can be expressed in a way that really no one sees. And that, to me, is probably the biggest danger. In the domestic sphere, and this is something actually that President Obama, I thought, had a very interesting perspective on. And much of the criticism of him, of being too muscular in terms of exercise of executive authority, were things that he did in the domestic area, which are fully transparent to not just the Congress, but also to the public at large, and therefore are able to be challenged in court. So his view was, look, if I'm going to, act, and I should say this it's not something he expressed, but I think it was something that I kind of inferred in the way that he thought about it. If I do something in the domestic space, yes, I might be criticized. Yes, the Congress might decide to retaliate either through some appropriations restriction or something else, and I might be sued. But then, it will be aired and it'll be litigated and it can be challenged in the court of law, and there will be, you know, a public debate about whether or not it was an appropriate exercise of authority or whether I went too far. Whereas in the other, the sort of the dark side of the world, you know, you just don't have that transparency. And so he felt someone who was very conscious all the time as a president, which is actually quite extraordinary, I think. Wasn't just his lawyers around him, but he himself was very conscious about the exercise of authority and how to do it responsibly and what it meant for the next president. And so it was often pushing us to think about ways to constrain, you know, his authority. He felt more comfortable exercising it in a robust way in domestic policy than in national security, which you know, I had not really thought about it that way, but it's quite interesting. You know, George W. Bush, on the other hand, most of the criticism against him for being too aggressive was almost all in the national security space. You know, it was on surveillance programs, on EITs, and those kinds of things.
Since we're talking about the White House Counsel's office, White House Counsel, I think in some respects the growth of the White House Counsel's office is a proxy for a shift of power. But a lot of that power, I would suggest, comes at the expense of the cabinet departments and agencies. A lot of the work that is now done in White House Counsel's office used to be done at OLC, Civil Division, SG's office. There are lots of reasons for that, but I think Kathy's staff was at least twice as large as mine. My staff was twice as large as Lloyd's when or much larger than Lloyd's when he worked for President Carter. But it's also, I think, the one reason that the presidents, have occupied a power void is that Congress is not using the power of the purse. Well, Iran-Contra, which consumed most of my 22 months as White House counsel, was a result of a prohibition on intelligence agencies using appropriated funds to fund the what we call the democratic resistance in Nicaragua, also known as the Contras. And the question was, did the National Security Council and the CIA breach that law? There were a number of such statutes. We were investigated regularly for supplementation of appropriations. I don't know how much you worried about that. I suspect not very much, because Congress was not. And every congressional committee has an oversight committee, but their one of their foremost powers is the power of the purse, and Congress has really abdicated that power in many respects. And if Robert C. Byrd, I never ever thought I would say this, but if Robert, I would like to see someone like Senator Byrd come back who's very jealous of the appropriations power of the Congress of the United States.
And the other area, too, that I think they've also really, have not asserted their authority is in the war powers.
Yes.
You know, they've completely, some would say, abdicated responsibility in that area, and which results in an accretion of executive authority. One of the things that was just fascinating to me, having worked through really, really complicated legal issues relating to Syria in the Obama administration, when President Trump, in the first 6 months in office, made a military strike in Syria, almost no one asked the question, well, what was the legal authority for that? It just was not, either domestically or internationally. What was the source of the legal authority, which is kind of astonishing if you think about it. And no one in the Congress asked it. And I think in a prior era,
yes.
You all would have been, if President Reagan had done something similar, you would have been up there in hearings and having to articulate exactly what the legal basis was. And this White House didn't have to do it. And that's pretty incredible.
So if Congress isn't using the power of the purse, in particular in the national security realm, and isn't getting involved to the same extent as it once did in the war powers, that would seem to leave a lot of legal decision-making as you put it, sort of in the dark.
Yeah.
That's a source of concern for many people. Could you talk about what it is that the president's lawyers are doing, of course, in general terms, in the dark to ensure that the executive branch is complying with the laws that do exist?
Well, you really have to rely in certain respects on, the integrity and kind of good government and commitment to a rule of law of individuals. I mean, the government is made up of individuals, and you have to rely on the fact that people are dedicated to upholding those principles. And so if you don't have that, and Congress isn't aggressively exercising oversight, which I would argue they haven't been doing either, just general congressional oversight, they're not concerned about the war powers, they're not concerned about appropriations oversight, then you really are left to that and frankly the Fourth Estate, and the press to expose these things, because otherwise there's just no way that you're gonna, there are no independent checks and balances. These are issues that are not litigated in courts, and so there's no other check, which is pretty scary. If you're in an environment where these institutions are not acting in ways that you expect them to act in a self-interested way. That's a huge protection. Even within the executive branch, you expect the State Department and the Secretary of State to come into the room, in the Situation Room, and assert, diplomatic sort of supremacy to a national security problem. You expect them to do that. And that sort of makes the system work. And you expect the Pentagon to come forward and say, okay, well, here's a military option. And you want the Secretary of State to say, here's a diplomatic option. And if you don't have that, and you don't have people asserting their institutional perspectives, then it really kind of degrades the quality of the decision making. And that the same is true when you're talking about, interbranch conflict.
So one question that comes to mind now is, if the first article branch isn't as active as it used to be in the national security sphere, should there be more room for the third branch to get involved? The questions of deference, questions of justiciability, they yield, at least to some degree, to a concern that if the courts aren't active in the area, it's the executive branch alone acting in the dark.
That is a constraint. That's what you should worry about. I can think of, we wrestled a lot with war powers. It's less in the dark than, that's a great description, but in the dark you have a lot of career, deeply experienced lawyers, as you know, who know all of the precedents, people, the legal advisor's office at state, the agency, DOD, their services, as the FBI, who are as deeply committed to the rule of law as any group of lawyers I know, and they have institutional prerogatives that they're protecting. But at times, I can remember we made a decision to snatch a terrorist off the coast of Cyprus in international waters, and it was quite unclear. This was a guy who killed a Navy diver on the tarmac in Beirut, and it was quite unclear whether we could keep him or not. But we nevertheless lured him to 13 miles offshore, arrested him, and flew him back and prosecuted him, and that was litigated. And all of us, and us being Bob Mueller, Bill Wells, me, Abe Sofair, people at the agency, and others, were holding our breath while his very good lawyers challenged the manner of his arrest. So at times you take the calculated risk, and we would have arguably undermined executive authority if we had been wrong.
And that is the calculation. You do think about that. If I take this position, we do this, and we had a similar thing with a guy named Warsami who we, had on a boat, and he was, subject to interrogation for many days. And ultimately, he was prosecuted in Article III court. But it was the same kind of notion at the time that he was apprehended, which is not how the military guys would. That's not the term they would use, but that's a law enforcement term. There was insufficient evidence at that time to prosecute him in an Article III court, but they sort of took a flyer, so to speak. They put him on a ship, and in international waters, and he was interrogated. And through that process, sufficient evidence was developed in order to successfully prosecute him in Article III court. But it wasn't at all clear that that was, going to happen, that was going to be a success story. And if it hadn't been a success story, then, we had real concerns about what the ramifications of that were. So, those are the kinds of calculations that you often have to make. And that's what I meant when I referred earlier to that, sometimes sort of a short-term assertion of executive authority, long-term may actually diminish executive authority.
Let me pivot away for a moment from national security toward another topic of some interest in the city these days, which is the operations of the White House counsel's office and situations where there are investigations underway, that there may be individuals within the White House at various levels who have at least potential exposure, whether of a civil or criminal variety, and how the White House counsel works through those situations of investigation to protect both, well, I'll let you say whether the goal is to protect the institution, the individuals, some combination of both. What are those relationships like, and what happens when someone walks in and says, I'm the personal lawyer for X, and I'm going to need the following from the White House?
I didn't have that problem. I didn't. President Reagan took the position he did nothing wrong, and he wasn't going to hire personal counsel. And he had been advised by a number of lawyers that he should have one, but he adamantly refused. And so I acted as best as I could in his behalf under the constraints I was under, which was that I was not his personal lawyer. There was not, I did think at the time there was an institutional attorney-client privilege. We had been advised by OLC.
Source of the best advice going.
That I think in a learned opinion that Ted Olson wrote, that there was an Upjohn type privilege, an institutional attorney-client privilege. But of course, that was litigated in the 8th Circuit and the D.C. Circuit, and it was found that there was no attorney-client privilege between the White House counsel and the president. But we were out there in another world where President Reagan didn't have personal counsel, and the Justice Department was recused from Iran-Contra. So we did build up a task force of about 90 people in the White House to help represent the president, not Ronald Reagan, but the president, the office of the president. And that's, how many angels can dance on the head of that pin, Kathy, when you're representing the office of the president as opposed to the individual. But that was the theory at the time. And I think that's basically what most White House counsel still say. They represent the office of the president.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one not entirely useful framework, but it does provide, I think, a good analogy, is that, your ultimately your client is the office of the president, but you also have sort of fiduciary obligation to the citizens of the United States, right? This is sort of what Lloyd Cutler said to you. And if you think about that almost as like shareholders of a company, I mean, you have a fiduciary obligation to the entity to protect the entity and to act in the entity's best interest, meaning the office of the presidency. And if the person who's occupying the office, if that person For example, if you learn that that person, has committed a criminal act, then, the law is pretty clear that the obligation of the White House counsel is to report that to the Attorney General. And that was, reiterated
Yes.
in the Lindsay case, by the DC Circuit. And so that makes it very different than a traditional attorney-client relationship, because that is clearly not an obligation that an attorney has in a private setting. And in fact, the obligation cuts entirely the other way. And meaning that you have an absolute duty of confidentiality in that circumstance. And so it makes it challenging because while that is a framework that you have to be aware of, at the same time, you are acting as a lawyer and you are trying to protect and defend the person who's sitting in the office. I think everyone on the staff, who are your clients by extension of working, they work for the president as well. But I think they all understand that if there's a conflict between an individual staff member and the president, that, the president's going to win. That in terms
There's
of,
only one way that conflict gets resolved.
there's only one way for that to get resolved. And then when you're dealing with personal counsel, Bob Bauer and I dealt with that issue, on several occasions, because Bob, of course, was President Obama's personal counsel, and I was his counsel in his official capacity. And there were times, and the one that most readily comes to mind, where Bob and I kind of had to sort it out. Which lane does this fall into? Were all of the lawsuits that were brought in the 2012 campaign challenging the president's candidacy, claiming that he was not born in the U.S. And so therefore was not, so the birther litigations. And so the question was that, something that was challenging, a challenge directed to him in his capacity as president or as candidate? And if it was the former, then the U.S. government traditionally would defend those lawsuits. And if it was the latter, then his personal or his campaign counsel would defend. And so, that was one that was kind of right on the line. Ultimately, we sort of, as I recall, we sort of split the baby, but we largely put it into the candidate context. And there were certain limited aspects where the Justice Department came in, but mostly we viewed that as litigation that was brought against him in his capacity as candidate, even though he was currently the President of the United States. I mean, it's a little nuts, but we actually had to think that through in sort of a methodical way.
I've got a follow-up on that, but we're going to have a bit of a question and answer period coming up. There's a gentleman up here who's got cards. If you'd like to write down your questions, pass them down. When I get the wave, we will turn to those questions. So my follow-up is this: that you also, in addition to the criminal civil litigation context, there's the investigations context, the congressional oversight context. I think it would be interesting to hear a little bit about how the counsel's office deals with that in interbranch relationship, where Congress is looking for information, maybe principally from the agency, but in some situations, principally from the White House itself, and how that's managed by the president's lawyers.
Yeah. So our approach was that if an agency got a request from a congressional committee to produce information, we would ask the agency that, to the extent that there was information in their possession that related to the White House, either that was communications to and from the White House, or otherwise had the parlance we would use as sort of White House equities, meaning that it was a policy that was very closely associated with the president, for example, or something that was a White House initiative or a White House kind of driven initiative. Then we would ask them to consult with us prior to producing anything to the Congress, so that we could have the opportunity to assert any privileges that we felt were appropriate to assert. And that worked pretty well. We would implement that, or remind people of that, by having a quarterly meeting with all the general counsels of the agencies at the White House. that the White House counsel would lead, and that's the way we worked that out. Now the risk of that, when you have the opposite party in control of either the House or the Senate, is that they will claim that the White House is essentially interfering or politicizing congressional oversight, and that's and we certainly got that criticism. I remember in one instance there was an allegation from the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee that the Department of Homeland Security was not producing information to them because the White House was essentially telling them not to. And those are things that you have to balance, but that's sort of the way that we worked it out. I don't know if you had a similar method.
Not really. And part of it's the origins of my power of the purse argument, because a lot of, other than the big four, state, defense, justice, treasury, and the CIA, most of the departments and agencies in the investigations world had already been taken hostage by their appropriators. So we would find out about documents going to the Hill after they went to the Hill, even if they did have White House equities. So, and I had 5 independent counsel investigations at the time under the statute. So we were in a very much a defense mode. And the issue that was often before us was whether or not to assert executive privilege or not. So that was, I think a divided government really increases the oversight burden.
How many times did you, sorry, because I'm interested in this. Do you remember how many times you asserted?
Well,
Formally,
fewer than 5, 4 or 5. Mm-hmm. We waived it on the Iran-Contra matter. We absolutely waived all privileges, just as a political judgment. By the way, I just because of Sidley, Peter Keisler was on my staff, and when we inherited a lot of litigation against President Nixon, because the current president sits in just like President Trump is the custodian of litigation from prior presidents in many respects. But Peter coined what he called the rule in Nixon's cases, which was Nixon always loses.
I'll turn to audience questions here, and we've got one that goes right to privilege. And the question asks, could you ask how Congress's refusal to recognize the deliberative process privilege serves as a constraint on executive power? And it goes on to ask what the Fast and Furious litigation left unsettled in that area.
Yeah. Well, that was so President Obama asserted it once in 8 years, and it was in the context of this Fast and Furious litigation, or Fast and Furious investigation, and going back to how the legal and the political always merge when you're defending the office of the president. President Obama asserted executive privilege in 2012, so it was an election year, and the House was controlled by the Republicans, and they decided that they were, going to make Fast and Furious their real sort of big oversight issue that they were going to press politically, and there were the concordant Republican, political ads that ran about it. And the person who sort of personified that scandal, if you will, was the Attorney General, Eric Holder. And so the assertion was in the context of the House Oversight Committee threatening to and ultimately holding the Attorney General in contempt. And over our refusal, the Justice Department's refusal to, provide documents that were not presidential communications, but were deliberative process documents. They were documents that the executive branch, they were the type of documents that the executive branch has long protected from disclosure. And what they were, we referred to them as kind of memos on memos documents, which requires a little bit of explanation. And what it is when you have an event, right? Something happens, whether it's Benghazi, or in this case there was these guns were being allowed to be transported over the border into Mexico. So that occurred, and Congress was investigating that thing. But what they were now trying to do was to investigate how we engaged with them about their investigation of that thing. So it's kind of the meta investigation, if you will. And it was our position, which is the longstanding position of the executive branch, that really gets right into kind of it's like attorney work product, at its core. It's what we decide is responsive to your request. It's how we're engaging with the press on the subject and all of that. And those were the documents that were at issue in the Fast and Furious assertion of privilege. What was unusual about the privilege is that it was by sort of necessity quite broad, because this was a massive amount of material, and we were just essentially saying this whole category of material you're not entitled to. You can have everything that you're entitled to about the underlying facts, but how we responded is different. So that ultimately did go to court and was contested, and was left unresolved because, as many of these disputes, they end up ultimately getting settled between the two branches, even if they have to go to court, and that's what happened there.
We don't have anything quite like that. The one I can recall, and it was the clearest case for asserting executive privilege, was a congressional committee asked the GAO to investigate our nomination process, how the president chose whom to nominate to federal office. And we thought that was pretty clear cut. We asserted the executive privilege, and we didn't negotiate.
Yeah, that's beyond the pale.
Right.
Is it easier or more difficult to advise a president who is a lawyer versus a non-lawyer on the legal limits of their authority? Is it easier to say no to a lawyer or a non-lawyer? You've each only had one experience, but your thoughts?
It depends on what the answer is, really, is the truth. Sometimes it was easier and sometimes it was harder. With President Obama, what was easier about it is that he had such a base level of knowledge of constitutional law that you didn't have to do a lot of table setting for him. He always saw exactly what the issue was, kind of straight away, and to a level of, sophistication that is quite shocking, I think, just because of his background and his genuine interest in the subject, right? So on those issues, that made it easier. But it also made it harder because, you're not really sliding by. So he would expect, a lot of rigor in terms of the analysis, and he would push you where, he knew that there was room for pushing. And on separation of powers questions, there's a lot of room for pushing, and there's very few actual, cases that are pure separation of powers cases that have, gone to the Supreme Court, for example. And so much of it is you're looking at precedent, you're looking at just the history of the toing and froing between the branches, and so, I would say for the most part, it made my job easier that he had that unbelievable, kind of background in training, except for when, he didn't like the answer that I gave him.
But when it was hard, it was really hard.
Yeah, exactly.
All I can say is Ronald Reagan was a great client. He took advice. He sought it. I had some allies, Howard Baker, a great lawyer, Dick Thornburg, Ed Meese. The only time I think I really had difficulty was the 1987 stock market crash, and trying to explain to Ronald Reagan why he had the authority to close the stock exchange, but not the authority to order it to stay open. And it was just a...
That is a puzzle.
Pardon?
That is a bit of a puzzle.
Well, it is I mean, it just defies logic, but it's a legacy from the Depression era. The 33 Act and 34 Act read together. But we finessed that a little bit by the president announcing, by leaking, frankly, that the president thought that the exchange should stay open and put the onus on the exchange if they were going to close it. But that was the only time he really pushed back hard because it just didn't make sense.
We had a similar one where the president really, pushed us because it was pretty dire circumstances, but it was in 2011, and the Republican House was threatening, not just threatening in a way that they kind of threaten now, but in a very, very real way, not to raise the debt ceiling. And the president was getting an enormous amount of pressure actually from Democratic members on the Hill to act unilaterally. And the question was, what could he do? And there were a lot of people on TV, et cetera, saying, well, he can just, quote, invoke the 14th Amendment to raise the debt ceiling, which, for any student of the Constitution knows is sort of silly because the 14th Amendment is actually a constraint on power. It's not a source of power. But there was, some language in there about the public debts shall be honored that, folks were saying, well, he can just invoke this. And, we really spent an enormous amount of time trying to think about, what, if anything, could he do unilaterally? You would think if he could unilaterally raise the debt ceiling, why couldn't he, by the same token, just raise taxes unilaterally? And of course, no one would argue that he could do that. But that was one where, we were talking about Youngstown Steel and really getting into, kind of the depths of separation of powers and, what he could do in a circumstance where all of the experts were saying, if the debt ceiling isn't raised, it's going to have very, very severe economic consequences. I mean, not just, just for a day or two, but potentially extremely severe. So that was dire, and ultimately a deal was reached, on the final hour.
The next question from the audience has to do with impeachment, which neither of you experienced during your time. But if the president is impeached, what role should perhaps the Office of the White House Counsel play in that interbranch drama?
Well, I experienced in the sense that I was on Howard Baker's staff during the Watergate era.
Okay.
I think the Clinton White House did it better than the Nixon White House in the sense of bringing in outside specialized counsel, whereas the Nixon White House tried to do it with special counsel, but in residing in the White House, and I think it is such an all-consuming responsibility to do it well, to do it right, and to advise the president that would be the model that I would use if I were ever to find myself in that position.
Yeah, I agree. I think you have to. It's such an all-consuming thing, and there's still, the government still has to run during that period of time, and so there have to be some people who are kind of minding the store and thinking about things other than that. And I think it's really just, it's pretty much, I would imagine, again, of course, I didn't live through it, and to be honest with you, it's not something that we ever even remotely contemplated or planned for, thankfully. But I was in the Clinton White House counsel's office post-impeachment, and so certainly learned a bit about how they dealt with it and just sort of their reverberations. And I think it seems to me like just as a structural matter, it's pretty critical to have special teams and there are lots of things that you can do outside of the White House that you just can't do from the White House, that a government employee, government official can't do, that, might need to be done.
I mean, think about it. The U.S. v. Nixon did not reach the point, but there is certainly strong dicta that House Judiciary Committee sitting in impeachment trumps executive privilege. So why would you run that, represent the president out as White House counsel, knowing you might get a subpoena from the House Judiciary Committee tomorrow for what you advised the president yesterday?
Yeah. Now, they would take the position that they trump attorney-client privilege as well, as,
Yes,
as you know.
absolutely, absolutely.
But you probably would be better off having that argument than the former argument.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it, and I frankly think it probably trumps both. The House Judiciary Committee sitting in impeachment. If you look at the Senate Watergate Committee case, U.S. v. Nixon, all the dicta, it's, and why would you run the risk?
So this next question is quite specifically for you, Kathy.
Okay.
But I'm gonna broaden it out.
Okay.
And I'll let you both speak to it. And so the specific question is, Kathy, you asked or touched on the point about the legal authority for the bombing in Syria during the Trump administration. The question is, what was the legal authority for the Obama administration's actions in Libya? And here's my
Mr. Bauer, would you care to answer that?
here's my broadening if you want to.
I can handle it.
If you want to take Bob off the hook, which is, and we've talked about this a little bit with respect to other questions that have come up. With lawyering in a situation where there really are no precedents that directly are providing guidance. So there are analogies that can be drawn. You talked about, looking at the Youngstown Steel cases to try and think about the scope of the president's authority to deal with a debt ceiling crisis. Obviously, not exactly a case in all fours. What's the role of the president's lawyers? What do the president's lawyers do when you're in a situation where you've got a very significant legal question, very serious consequences? There's obviously going to be public controversy about the choice that's made, and yet very little in the way of direct guidance. What's the process? You mentioned that's partly political, but what's the legal side of that? How do people start to operate to figure out where the lines are in that kind of situation?
Well, the way that I thought about it was, how do you mitigate risk? How do you mitigate litigation risk? If the president is going to take an action, and it's not clear that he can't, which is true in most actions that presidents take, right? It's just not obvious that the answer is that he can't do it because there's nothing that's on all fours. So then the question is, okay, well, if he's going to take the action, how can we structure it in a way that mitigates political risk, that mitigates litigation risk, that has some built-in constraints, because that'll help you generally in litigation if it's challenged. Because the court's going to say, well, what are the limiting principles around this particular action? So then you start to think about how to best structure it to make it as defensible as possible, that you can get the people who are going to be inclined to be supportive of the president's actions, so you can make them feel comfortable that they can go out and support it. Legal scholars, constitutional scholars, that kind of thing. That's a big part of when you're sort of setting up an apparatus to defend an action, you need to think that through on the front end. Because what you don't want to do is have the president do something and then there's not a single person, in kind of the respected legal community who will defend it. Then you're leaving the president really exposed. So, you could spend a lot of time sort of sitting around and thinking about what the best reading of the law is, but oftentimes you just don't have, that guidance at all. With respect to, to Libya, and not to folks who don't have the full background there, that was a situation where we had, it was a NATO-led military action that we, the U.S., were supporting. So, and the initial, if I'm recalling this, Bob, right, the initial action that we took was part of that NATO-led action, but also we had a UN security resolution, as I recall. UN Security Council resolutions on the international law side. The issue came up with respect to the 60-day clock on the War Powers Resolution. and whether or not, we had to basically get congressional authorization to continue the activities that we were doing in Libya post that 60-day clock. And the analysis that, and there was a lot of division of opinion within the executive branch and within the lawyers group, sort of debating this. And ultimately the conclusion was that because we were just supporting this NATO-led action and we didn't have boots on the ground, that we, the U.S., were not engaged in hostilities as that term is envisioned and defined by the War Powers Resolution. And, that position was criticized by a lot of people, and they thought that we were sort of dancing on the head of a pin. But that was the position we took, and in the getting back to our conversation about abdication, the real world practical reality of that scenario was that there was not a single member of Congress who wanted us to send up a resolution, not a single member. And in fact, they were communicating to us both implicitly and explicitly, whatever you do, do not send that legislation up because we don't want to take a vote on it. So, you're in a situation where operationally, your military professionals are saying, these are operations that you need to continue. The Congress is saying, you may think that the War Powers Resolution requires you to, have us vote on something, but we don't want to vote. And we believed that we had a sound legal basis for allowing those operations to continue, and so that was the analysis.
And in Kathy's defense, we took the same position.
It's Bob's defense.
Bob's defense.
I was only the deputy counsel at the time.
I will not defend Bob then. And in Bob's defense, we took the same position when we escorted Kuwaiti tankers in the Persian Gulf. Each firefight was its own event.
Yep.
Each firefight was its own event.
We may have used that as precedent.
But the real answer, I think, is if you only have lawyers in the room, or if you only have lawyers and generals and admirals in the room, you need to broaden the room. Yeah. Because this is a situation where often consulting with congressional leadership gets you to where you want to be.
Well, exactly, and I can tell you, our head of legislative affairs was like, losing his mind with the idea that the lawyers might say that this was required, because he was hearing from members every single day that this is not something that they wanted. Exactly. So, it's interesting. This really, it's a great example of this idea of the, toing and froing, and how the Congress has sort of said, we have this authority. It's a law that, we pass, but by the way, we're not going to exercise it.
Which is interesting and maybe kind of brings us a little bit full circle on power and constraint, because, of course, there are people who have taken the view very publicly that the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional in some respects because it pops up in precisely this situation where the president has a view of what the national security requires, and you have a Congress that either doesn't want to deal with it or can just say no without providing, sort of acting proactively in a productive way with respect to it. Some might ask, that could have been a perfect situation for the Obama White House to preserve presidential power for the next president.
And then remember that in Syria, the president did seek authorization of the use of military force, and they didn't even bring it up to a floor vote. So, so that's an example of where the president made a different decision, sought the authorization from Congress, and not only did they not, give it to him, but it just sort of died on the vine, which is pretty extraordinary.
I wonder if that. Well, I was about to muse, but I see the 0-minute sign popping up in front of me. So you're spared my musings. Let me thank Kathy and AB for their insights. And great questions from the audience as well. Thank you.
First of all, I want to make a few closing remarks. I'm closing the conference out before anybody criticizes me again. So it's over with, okay? You can't do it again. But secondly, I want to thank each and every one of you for coming. I want to thank particularly the panelists, all of our panelists and the moderators, the enormous support we've gotten that we greatly appreciate from Sidley Austin in sponsoring this forum from year to year. We'll have a reception afterwards. We invite you to attend the reception. For the clinic students, stay here for a bit because we have our annual photo coming up. But other than that, the reception's on, the event is closed, and thank you very much.